Hey folks, Matt Easton here, scholagladiatoria. So we're going to talk here a little bit more about the medieval falchion. So what we have here specifically is a type of falchion which was used pretty much universally with a shield in close combat, and of a type that was popular in the, shall we say, 12th to beginning of the 14th century, but particularly its heyday really was in the 13th century. Now, a common misconception about falchions is that they are heavy and that they are like a combination between a sword and an axe. And I feel that this is sort of a misnomer. In fact, I think it's completely a misnomer. Let's just have a little look at this falchion. So, a dispenser with a shield. As mentioned, shields are pretty much intrinsics to the use of these weapons. Could you use one of these alone? Yes, you could just about use it as a single sword by itself at a push, but you wouldn't really choose to. They are intended to be used, probably after a spear or a lance is dispensed with, but they are intended to be used with a shield primarily because, of course, you can see for yourself that the weight distribution of this weapon, it does have a fair amount of mass at the tip, and it's not the most nimble weapon to be trying to form guards with and this kind of thing. It's not particularly quick, but of course it is fairly powerful as a result. But what do I mean when I say it's not like an axe? Well, let's just consider this for a minute. So first of all, an axe has all of the weight centered at the end of it. A falchion doesn't. A falchion has far better weight distribution than that. It is more sword-like in the hand. However, as you can see, it does nevertheless have a pretty broad tip on it. But one of the misconceptions, and I think one of the reasons why there's this misconception about falchions, is that a lot of falchions are really quite poor reproductions. Now this, I have featured this in videos previously. This is a rather nice example made by Paul Binns, and it is inspired by two historic falchions that still survive. One is the Conyers falchion, which is in England, and the other is the Cluny falchion, which is in Paris and France. And the Cluny falchion is actually quite a lot smaller than this. However, if you look at a picture of it, this looks most like the Cluny falchion. However, the Cluny falchion, as mentioned, is relatively short. If I remember correctly, it only has about a 25-inch blade. This is about a 30-inch blade, and therefore it is of the size of the Conyers falchion. So if you like, this is sort of the styling of the Cluny falchion with the size and proportions and weight of the Conyers falchion. Now, the reason that lots of replicas don't get falchions right and lead to lots of misconceptions about falchions and what they are and how they work is because a lot of medieval replicas of weapons are made for reenactment, or things like HMB, Battle of the Nations type stuff. And those weapons inevitably and obviously are blunt. And not only are they blunt, but they very often require a certain degree of bluntness that equates to about, I think it's about a 3mm edge or something like that. Now, if you have to create a blade which is that thick at the edge, it very much dictates the weapon that you end up with and how it feels and how it handles. And indeed, if you want to make a weapon that is this shape, but which is that blunt at the edge, you do in fact end up with something which handles somewhat similarly to an axe. Ironically, these weapons, various types of falchion and cleaver, are rather popular in modern full contact armoured fighting, such as HMB and Battle of the Nations type fighting and IMCF, because they do hit hard. They hit a bit like a mace, they hit a bit like an axe. And of course, if you're fighting in armour, as I have covered many times in my channel, if you're fighting in armour, hitting someone with an actual sharp sword is not very effective. In fact, it's very ineffective. That's almost certainly why we see very little, we could say almost zero, hitting of armour with long swords in the medieval fencing books, in the treatises. What you see predominantly, of course, with long swords is half swording and use of the point, and grappling and wrestling, and use of the crossguard and the pommel and things like this. The edge of the sword is not very effective. That, of course, does leave us with a question. What were these sharp falchions like, and what were they for? Well, first of all, what were they like? Well, I have brought out my calipers again. So I've got my calipers ready just to give you, so this is the right kind of, this is a historical inspired by historical examples with a historically accurate kind of weight distribution and distal taper and all of this. If we go to the base of the blade, it's not especially thick at the base of the blade. It is, let's get in there, it's 5.3 millimeters. If we go, say, 1/3 up the blade, it goes down to 4.3 millimeters. Then it goes down to 3.1 millimeters, and then up here it's 2 millimeters. So as you can see, the distal taper, really, the thickness of the blade really drops off as we go along. The result of that is this weapon weighs 3 pounds. 3 pounds is the same weight as lots of slightly heavier, in fact, arming swords and some rapiers, which of course have much longer blades, but which are obviously much narrower. As I've covered before I've done a video about weights of historical swords, and I pointed out that this, although it looks massive and it looks incredibly beefy, only weighs the same as a longsword, or it weighs the same as a rapier, for example, about 3 pounds. There's a very good reason that swords end up not generally in real swords, that is, real historical swords, end up generally not exceeding certain weights. And that, of course, is because there are certain optimum weights for what you can realistically fight with a sharp weapon, either in one-on-one fighting or in battles. Of course, there are some people who could use heavier swords, but the average, this kind of 3 pound weight for a one-handed sword, and indeed many hand-and-a-half swords, is fairly common. There are examples of falchions which are lighter than that. There are smaller ones that aren't quite as broad as this, or not quite as long as this, which are lighter. So falchions don't rely on weight. If we actually look at the historical surviving falchions, they are not at all, not even remotely, like an axe or a mace. They don't seem to at all be interested with putting all of the weight into the end to make for striking sort of impact damage as such. So what were they for? What's their purpose? And they've got very thin blades. A lot of people would go, oh, they're obviously essentially percussive, almost percussive weapons with an edge like an axe for use against people in armour. But were they? These actually have, although they're very broad, they actually have really fine, thin edges. The degree of edge damage you're going to take from hitting helmets, for example, if I take a helmet and smash, this is a very good steel by medieval standards, this is EN45 hardened to about 50 Rockwell, that is about as good as you can hope from a medieval European sword in the 13th century. In fact, better. This is far better steel than they generally had in the 13th century. But if I took this and full power blow, powered it into my opponent's helmet, the result would be a scratch and maybe a bit of a dent to that helmet, although that helmet itself is hardened carbon steel. That's a bit later, that's a 14th century style helmet. If I hit that with the edge of this blade, the result would be minimal damage to the helmet, no damage at all to the person wearing the helmet, and quite considerable damage to my blade. If it wasn't bent and buckled and possibly chipped, it would certainly be dull. And despite the fact it would have started off sharp, practically razor sharp, and now it wouldn't be sharp anymore. So the question has to come, what were these big sharp cleavers for? And I'm not going to give a categorical answer in this video because quite simply nobody knows. The leading researcher on falchions and messers, which of course are related swords, although not the same exactly, but they are related, is James Elmsley, and based up in Scotland. And I correspond a bit with James on Facebook and elsewhere, and hopefully at some point we'll get to meet up and do some videos together. I very much hope that's the case. I know that he watches these videos, so hopefully he'll watch this video at this point, at some point. But we talked about this, and the short answer is nobody really knows. There's been lots of historians have assumed, made the same assumption as lots of reenactors make, based on the blunt reenactment versions of falchions, which are nothing really like at all the actual sharp replicas or the originals of sharp falchions, that they're impact weapons. But that just doesn't seem to be the case. Clearly they wanted to centre cutting capacity at the tip of the blade. We can say that much. Clearly they weren't that concerned about thrusting capacity, because the shape of this type, certainly there are some types of falchion where they do have a clipped back, and obviously they're trying to bring back thrusting potential to those, but for this type, this will be an appalling thruster. Against an unarmoured person, of course, it's going to go into their body. Basically anything pointy will go into a human's body if they're not wearing anything. But it clearly has sacrificed thrusting potential and increased chopping potential. But who is it intended to chop? It's not intended to chop through helmets. That's simply not going to happen. Although it may be shown in some kind of heroic art, sort of legendary art, mythical art, like the Machiavelli Bible, which shows people cleaving right the way through people's bodies and chopping through helmets and all this kind of stuff. That's a kind of heroic, if you imagine the medieval version of the movie The 300, it's basically like that. But in reality, trying to chop through a helmet, come on, it's more or less a waste of time. And is it going to chop through mail? Well, again, people have done lots of experiments. I intend at some point to do experiments myself with trying to chop through and thrust through and shoot through riveted mail, good reproduction riveted mail. Can you cut through mail? Sometimes you can burst some links. I don't think you're literally cutting through it. Even if you can cut through a single ring, the other rings around it moving and shifting, and the gambeson or accuton underneath absorbing the impact, make it nigh on impossible really that you can chop through. You can maybe break some rings. You can certainly hurt a person through mail and gambeson. You can break someone's arm, you can break their ribs, certainly. And you can thrust through it. If you send a lance on horseback, you can put that through mail and gambeson. You can shoot arrows through it if you're lucky, if you use the right type of arrows. But the edge of a sword or an axe, it's just distributing the force over too large an area. The edge is making contact with too many bits of mail armour, and with the padding underneath absorbing it and the mail moving and rippling, and it's very, very difficult to cut through. So I don't think that these were intended for cutting through helmets. I don't think they were intended for cutting through mail. Certainly they're not going to cut through something like a coat of plates, which was starting to come around in the 13th century. I don't think they're for cutting through lamellar armour, because you have an even worse chance of cutting through that than through mail. And frankly, there wasn't a lot of lamellar in Western Europe in the 13th century. There was in Eastern Europe, in Asia, but in Western Europe there wasn't much lamellar armour, and these were very common. So perhaps they were for chopping up less armoured people. And I think that has to be one of, for the time being, I'm not saying it's absolutely correct, but that has to be one of the leading conclusions, that these weren't necessarily weapons optimised for fighting your peers, in other words, other knights. This is a knightly weapon. That's another misconception about falchions, is that they're a peasant weapon. Not at all. Okay, it doesn't seem to be at all the case. Yes, there were certain types of cleaver and agricultural weapon which absolutely were used by peasant levies or town militias or lower class soldiers, but this type of falchion almost invariably is shown in the hands of knights, men at arms, rich people, upper class people in the 13th century, used, as mentioned, in conjunction with the shield. So what were they using it for? Why were they choosing it? Well, in the 13th century, it was before the age of more professional common soldiers en masse, by and large. So in the 14th century we see the rise of the first beginnings of professional crossbowmen, longbowmen being paid better rates and serving almost as professional soldiers. The cantons in Switzerland with the beginning of sort of almost professional militias or permanent militias. In the 14th century, a century later, after these weapons kind of go out of favour, we're kind of talking around the time that these start to get phased out and plate armour becomes more common for knights. In the 13th century that wasn't the case. In the 13th century you are indeed dealing with large masses of lower class soldiers, and the people wearing the armour, using the heater shields, riding horses, using lances, wearing mail, wearing a great helm, are in the minority. They may only make up 10 or 20% of some armies, if that. So perhaps these swords weren't for fighting against armour. Perhaps these swords were the most efficient way of chopping up common soldiers who were either not wearing any armour or were only wearing gambesons. And I have to say that is my leading theory at the moment. When I look at the originals of these swords, like the Conyers and the Cluny and the other, there's not many, but the other surviving 13th century falchions around, when I look at the originals and then I handle a good quality replica like this absolutely, to me, yes, you could absolutely try and break people's arms and legs if they're wearing mail armour with it. I wouldn't bother trying to hit someone in the helmet with it because I'm just going to mash up my sword and not going to hurt them very badly. But limbs, yes, absolutely. But by and large, I think this is not an anti-armour sword to me. This is actually a chopping up large hunks of meat. If I thought about if I had a cow carcass to butcher, yeah, that would do the job. It's, to me, a butcher's cleaver. And butcher's cleavers aren't designed for cutting through armour. The best thing to go through armour is a point. And it's an interesting point as well that the 13th century, if we look at arming swords, is when we see the transition towards pointier and pointier swords. Type 14 swords, for example, start to come in. And by the beginning of the 14th century, pretty much most arming swords that were carried by knights at least are pointy types, the type 15. So I think that, to conclude, I think this sword is a knightly sword. It is not a peasant sword. It's a knightly sword, but it's not a sword that's optimised for fighting other knights. It's a knightly sword that is optimised for chopping up your lessers. I think it's a meat chopper for chopping up peasant levies that you've got into the middle of in your heavy armour, and your shield is there for defence, and they are armed primarily with spears, sometimes other pole weapons, but you are at point blank range with them, carving up as many of them as you possibly can, with them raining down blows on you and you trusting in your armour and your shield to protect you. And this, to me, is a meat chopping weapon. When we look at the fineness of the edge, the breadth of the blade, the way that thrusting has practically been thrown aside, at least with this style of falchion blade, I think these falchions are for chopping up peasants. That's my theory for now. It may change. Cheers, folks. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe, follow us on Facebook. You can buy t-shirts through Spreadshirt, support us on Patreon, or follow us on Pinterest. Thank you.